Well, we are continuing on this morning in the book of Genesis, where we're going to spend the vast majority of our fall, really the time that leads right up to Thanksgiving. And we're jumping into the middle of a narrative, which is the story of Abraham. Now, some of you may be familiar with the story of Abraham, others of you may not, but Abraham is really a major character of the Bible. If you're thinking about especially Genesis, it's all about Abraham and the promise to Abraham. And God had made a promise to Abraham. God said to Abraham, I'm going to give you a people, I'm going to make a people out of you, and I'm going to give you a land. And really the story of Abraham as it begins to unfold is that Abraham has no children and no home. He's a nomad with no kids. And God says, I'm going to give you a land, a home, and I'm going to give you a people. And it's one of those places where God makes these promises to you, and you go, that's great, God. That sounds amazing. I would love that. So where is that? Just not yet. Like, okay. And God's like, and he reiterates the promise. Oh, by the way, I'm going to give you a home and a people. Fantastic. Would love that. When does that happen? Not quite yet. And so we're getting to this place now where as the story unfolds today, Sarah is 90, and so we would say well beyond childbearing years, and yet they still have no child, and God has still made the promise, I'm going to give you a land and a people. Now, spoiler alert is the fact that we all call Abraham Father Abraham, that all of the major religions call Abraham one of their fathers of the faith, would indicate to you that God fulfilled his promise, that God made a multitude of people out of Abraham's line, and he's done that. And so last week we looked at a story out of Genesis 20, where there's lots of places where Abraham is faithful. Last week we looked at a story where he was unfaithful. And as we had said, is that there's going to be times in which we look at and we read the Abraham story, especially in a couple of weeks, when he goes to sacrifice his son, you go, I could never do that. I could never do that. But there's these places of unfaithfulness where you think to yourself, I would never do that. And the truth is, well, you may not do that, but you would do other things. And so we really all have this experience where we actually, moments of great faithfulness, moments of unfaithfulness. And what we want to do, as we talked about last week, we want to be critically appreciative. So we can be critically appreciative of Abraham. And so those places where he's faithful, we are so appreciative of Abraham. And the places where he is unfaithful, it's okay that we're critical of him. It's okay to say, this was not a good idea. This was not a good thing. This was not done in faithfulness. And really, truth be told, of all of the characters in the Bible, all of the heroes of the Bible, you can be critically appreciative. Save one, which is Jesus, right? You probably knew that. Jesus, which for him, we're just appreciative. And no need to be critical of him. And so, and so this morning we're going to jump back into the story that we actually looked at last week, was Genesis 20. And in this story, there's four main characters. There's Abraham, there's Abimelech, there's Sarah, and there's God. And last week we looked at the story through the lens of Abraham and Abimelech and God, and then a little bit of Sarah. And this week, today, we're going to look through this lens of Abraham and Sarah and God. And really, because what's going to happen, as we see here, is that this is going to have major implications, not for just Abimelech, but for Sarah in this. Sarah, a woman who maybe feels like she has no voice and no power, who is we would say, turned over then to Abimelech for what Abraham perceives to be his own good. So, if you got your Bibles, we're going to jump right in. We're going to start at chapter 20, verse 1. It goes like this. From there, Abraham journeyed toward the territory of the Negeb and lived between Kadesh and Shur. And he sojourned in Gerar. And Abraham said of Sarah, his wife, she is my sister. And Abimelech, king of Gerar, sent and took Sarah. And so Abraham and Sarah, they show up. And Abraham says of Sarah, and I love how the Bible here says, who is his wife, who Abraham said of Sarah, his wife, she is my sister. And then the king Abimelech, which really, Abimelech just means my father is king. Really Abimelech says, oh, well then if she's just your sister, then I will take her to be my wife. Now this story is going to sound super familiar from Genesis chapter 12. Also from last week, because we covered it last week, but if you're reading through Genesis chapter 12, because we see a very similar story. And some people think this is a double. I don't think it's a double. I think it's just the cycle of sin, right? There are certain sins that you come back to over and over again. Certain things you don't battle with. Maybe you don't battle with greed. Maybe greed's not your thing, but maybe rage is your thing. And so you can look at people that are greedy and go, they're so greedy. You go, yeah, but what about your anger, how your anger gets out of control? Like, well, that's totally different. And what happens is that we cycle through, and we cycle through. And what we find out here, as we're going to find out in this story, is that actually this was their practice, as it says, everywhere they went. They would go to these places, they wouldn't know people, they were nomads, so they didn't have a lot of places to be home at. And every time they went to a place that was not their home, they were strangers, this was their practice. When we show up, Abraham would say, when we show up, Sarah, you say that you are my sister. And this appears to be Abraham's line of thinking. His line of thinking appears to go like this. So if we show up, I say that you're my wife, they're going to kill me, and they're going to take you as their wife, right? But if we show up and I say you're my sister, they don't kill me, and then they will still take you as their wife. So really, there's no story in which this ends where you don't end up as their wife, but there is a story that ends where I end up alive, the other one I end up dead. So if we could do a huge favor, since you're going to be their wife either way, let's just say that you're my sister. That way I can live. That seems to be Abraham's line of thinking. There's no outcome that you're not their wife, and so I think it's just better this way. There's two things that Abraham does in this. The first is that he denies the identity that would help protect her. The fact that he is the wife, that she is the wife, would help. That's an identity that would protect her. Saying that she's my sister actually puts her in great harm's way. And so this idea that he would say she's my sister, he actually denies the identity that would help protect her. And this idea that by evoking the lesser identity, you are denying the greater, more important identity. So by evoking the lesser identity, you are denying the greater identity. You don't think that's true? All right, guys, do this for me. Next time you go to a party where people do not know your wife, maybe like a work party, you introduce her as the mother of your children. Oh, this is the mother of my children? Wait, is that not technically true? Well, technically that is true. This is my roommate. Wait, roommate? Yeah, we share a room, right? Yeah, what's happening there, right, is that you are, by evoking the lesser, this is the mother of my children, this is my roommate, you are denying the greater, which is, she's my wife, right? And so actually a lot of people would assume that if you had said, this is the mother of my children, like, oh, that did not go well. That did not end well. And you would get back in that car and there would be a harsh conversation, right? Or probably worse, there would be no conversation. It's like, oh, so I'm your roommate, right? I'm your roommate. I'm just the mother of your children. Like, those things aren't true? Well, they are true. But I'm also your wife. Well, yeah, but I didn't say that you weren't my wife. Okay. Roommate. Right? So this is what would happen. By evoking the lesser, you're denying the greater. And so by saying that she's my sister, he's actually denying the one that would protect her, which is this idea which is her identity, which is that she is his wife. And what I love here is where Abraham fails, the biblical author, as we believe to be Moses, gets it right. She's my wife, but she's my sister, but the Bible's very clear. The author's like, Sarah, who is his wife. Abraham got it wrong. I'm going to correct that, get it right. She is his wife. Said of her, she's my sister. So the first thing that Abraham does in this is that he denies her the greater identity that would help protect her. The second thing is that he avoids harm's way by having her actively walk into harm's way. I don't want to be hurt, and you're going to be hurt either way. So who cares, right? So let's just. I'm going to. In order to avoid harm's way, I'm going to have you actively walk into harm's way. By the way, this sounds a lot like Abraham's father, Adam. Adam and Eve. You know the story. God put the tree in the Garden of Eden, said you can eat freely of any of the trees. There's one tree you cannot eat from. That is the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. And the day that you eat of that tree, you will die. And then Eve comes along. She sees the fruit. It looks good to her. She likes it. Satan comes along and says, did God really say you can't do that? Why would God deny you all of these great, wonderful things? God's really withholding from you something greater. And it says that she saw it, she wanted it, she saw that it was good so she wanted it, her heart wanted it, it was good for wisdom, it was good for food. And so she took it and she ate. And I love the way that Genesis reads because it says, and then she gave some to her husband who was there with her. Now, you're so familiar with the story that doesn't blow your mind. But if you're reading this the first time, you would just be picturing Eve and serpent, Eve and serpent, Eve and serpent. And then there's this plot twist that goes, and she gave some to Adam who was there the whole time. To which, as the reader, you're supposed to go, wait, Adam was there? And you go, yeah, actually, Adam was sitting passively by as Eve was actively walking into harm's way, and he said not a word. And actually, I'm reading into it, but I don't think much. I think actually Adam is just thinking, I wonder what's going to happen. I wonder what's going to happen to her. Let's see what happens to her. Let's see if she dies. If she dies, then I'll be like, well, she shouldn't have done that. Like, she should not have done that. God, you're going to give me another rib maybe, or another helper or something. I'm not sure how you do this. But I think really we see the same thing. Adam is sitting passively by while Eve is actively walking into harm's way. And here is what Abraham does. Is Abraham, he puts Eve actively in harm's way so that he can avoid harm's way itself. Adam has Sarah, his wife, actively walk into harm's way so that he can avoid it. This is literally, is what we would understand to be anti-gospel. The gospel, the death of Jesus, death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus, that he came, he died on the cross, rose 3 days later. He died on the cross for us and our sins. He died in our place and for us. But what God did there is he actively put himself into harm's way for the good of the covenant relationship. It's interesting because what Abraham does is Abraham says, no, I'm going to avoid harm's way. I'm going to actively put you into harm's way for the good of the covenant relationship. And then the gospel comes along and says, no. I'm going to actually put myself into harm's way so that you aren't harmed for the good of the covenant relationship. That's the gospel. And here, this is where Abraham, he fails. And by the way, as we would understand this to be, is that Abraham does this. He avoids harm's way, and by avoiding harm's way, he abandons the marriage covenant. So by avoiding harm's way, he abandons the marriage covenant. And then Jesus, who puts himself in harm's way, establishes the covenant. And so we see these even in the beginnings in Genesis 20, we're seeing these echoes, these foreshadowings of the gospel that is to come. And by the way, when somebody says you need to put yourself into harm's way for the good of this relationship, often that's abuse, just so you know that. When somebody says you need to put yourself in harm's way for the good of this relationship, for the good of this covenant marriage, we'd say that's often abuse. And actually, the opposite is often love, which says, may harm not come to us. May harm not come to any one of us. But if harm has to come to either one of us, may harm come to me before it comes to you. We go, that's love. And what we see here is we see Abraham fail in this. He's actively avoiding harm's way while Sarah, his wife, not his sister, is actively walking right into harm's way. And so the story then goes on in verse 3. It says this, but God came to Abimelech in a dream by night and said to him, behold, you are a dead man because of the woman whom you have taken, for she is a man's wife. Now Abimelech had not approached her, so he said, Lord, will you kill an innocent people? Did he not himself say to me, she is my sister? And she herself said, he is my brother. In the integrity of my heart and the innocence of my hands, I have done this. Then God said to him in the dream, yes, I know that you have done this in the integrity of your heart, and it was I who kept you from sinning against me. Therefore, I did not let you touch her. Now then, return the man's wife, for he is a prophet, so that he will pray for you, and you shall live. But if you do not return her, know that you shall surely die, you and all who are yours. And so where Abraham fails the marriage, God succeeds. And even though Abraham failed to evoke the greater identity, she's my wife, God does. Where Abraham failed to evoke the identity of Sarah, actually God comes in and evokes that identity. He says, oh, by the way, Abimelech, who you have taken, is married. There's the biblical marriage has three parties, right? God, husband, and wife. There's the three parties. There's the covenant, we talked about a little bit last week. There's a covenant being made between the couple. Then there's a covenant being made between the husband and God, and then the wife and God, and then the husband to the wife. And I think a lot of times all we think about is the covenant between the husband and wife. You go, yeah. But there's actually a greater covenant that's being made, and the greater covenant that's being made in a biblical marriage is that between God. And I've gone to lots of marriages, lots of weddings where it's just, I haven't done them because, anyways, I haven't done those. I've gone to weddings where it's just the covenant between each other. But all the weddings I do is covenant between God and you, and now each other. And so of these three parties, there is this marriage covenant relationship. And really the understanding, right, is that the vows, will you take this person to be your lawfully wedded husband or wife? To have and to hold from this day forward. In other words, something's being established from this day forward, right? In sickness and in health, in richer for poor, for better or for worse, right? Forsaking all others, until death do us part. I do. Now you're all married? No. Okay, whoa, how did that happen so fast? I didn't even know I got married. Right, but that's the vow. Now that vow is not scriptural, right? We can't quote scripture because that's a vow, but it's a good vow, and I think the ideas of those vows are scriptural, right? This idea of from this day forward, something's being established, something's going to be true after today that was not true before today. In sickness and in health, for better or for worse, for richer or for poor. No matter what life brings us, that's not going to change this covenant. Man, you could get sick, wouldn't change my promise. We could become rich, wouldn't change my promise. We could become poor, wouldn't change my promise. You could die, I'd be on your deathbed, wouldn't change my promise. And the idea is that no matter the circumstances that life bring us, it won't change my promise. Forsaking all others, no matter who else life brings us, right? So the circumstances, no matter what life may bring us, the forsaking all others, no matter who else life may bring us, we forsake all others until death do us part. In other words, this is a covenant that will only be, we say, fulfilled upon death. Now we find out later is that it can be also then done and broken with adultery. Now here's the thing. Abraham knows this. God knows this. Abimelech knows this. And everybody seems to be taking this seriously except for who? Abraham. And actually, because look at what God does. God does not come to a dream with Abimelech and give him suggestions. What is he like? He does not show up in the dream and go, hey, psst, Abimelech. Hey, buddy, hey, just FYI, you might need to know this information, but do with this what you will. But the woman that you have taken is actually married. And like you should probably do right by her and by him and give her back. Is that how God comes? How does God come? you're a dead man. What? Yeah, God shows up to you. You want God to speak to you in a dream, just not this way, right? You're a dead man. You're a dead man. What did I do? That would be your first thing. What did I do? You took this other man's wife. That's okay, hold on, God. That's not what she said. That's not what he said. They said this, with the integrity of my heart, my hands, I did not touch her. God's like, yeah, that's true, but it's also because I did not let that happen. Now, God does not say, do what you will. What does he say? Send her back. If you send her back, you will live. If you don't send her back, you will die. And not only will you die, but everybody in your household is dead. So God seems to take this, as we would say, very seriously. And I want you to notice the contrast. Abraham is afraid for his life, right? He's afraid they're going to kill him. And so he's unfaithful to the marriage covenant. Abimelech is afraid for his life. He's afraid God's going to kill him. And so then he's actually faithful to the marriage covenant. It's this interesting thing is that depending on what you fear and how you fear will determine a lot of your unfaithfulness or faithfulness. See, misplaced fear will almost always lead to unfaithfulness. That's right. Right now, we've got a lot of misplaced fear on all sorts of sides. And know this, that misplaced fear often leads to unfaithful decisions. This is why Jesus says, you want to be afraid of something? Don't be afraid of the one that can just kill you. Be afraid the one that can destroy the body and the soul, which is God. Other than that, all your fears are misplaced. Misplaced fear. And so it's interesting that Abimelech fears his life. He's faithful. Abraham fears his life. He's unfaithful. Chapter 20, verse 8. Turns out everybody's afraid. So Abimelech rose early in the morning and called all his servants and told them all these things. And all the men were very much afraid. The only one who's not afraid is feel like, oh, phew, she's my sister. I'm going to take her as my wife. Phew, that was close. I was going to die back there. The only one that doesn't seem to be afraid, right, is Abraham. Everybody else is in harm's way. Sarah, Abimelech's people. It goes on in verse 9. Then Abimelech called Abraham and said to him, what have you done to us? And how have I sinned against you, that you have brought on me and my kingdom a great sin? You have done to me things that ought not to be done. And Abimelech said to Abraham, what did you see that you did this thing? And Abraham said, I did it because I thought there is no fear of God in all of this place, and they will kill me because of my wife. Besides, she is indeed my sister, the daughter of my father, though not the daughter of my mother, and she became my wife. And when God caused me to wander from my father's house, I said to her, this is the kindness. Hear this. This is the kindness you must do to me. At every place which we come, say of me, he is my brother. And so when Abraham is confronted, we talked a lot about this last week, though, but the blame shifts. First of all, what'd you do to us? Abraham, first of all, not my problem. Not my fault. You guys are known as inhospitable people who do not fear God. That's your problem. And that's the reason why I made decisions like I made. So first of all, not my problem. This is your fault because this is how you're known. The second thing where he talks about is that it's not my fault you didn't ask more questions. Technically, it's true. Technically, she is my sister. And if you would have said, is she also your wife? Because that's weird. Is she also your wife? I would have said, yeah, it's not my fault you didn't ask more questions. But notice the last one is this: God caused me to wander. When God caused me to wander, I said to Sarah, you must do this kindness to me. That everywhere, remember, they're nomads. So people go, man, this happened twice. I go, there's a good chance it happened more than twice. Because what it says is everywhere we go, they're nomads. So you do the math. I don't know. but everywhere we go, you must do this kindness to me, that you say that you're my brother. Now, it may not always have happened like then the person in control, or the king or the Pharaoh took Sarah, but probably everywhere they showed up, this is my brother. Like, oh, okay, that's fine. But this is the kindness. You must, everywhere we go, you must put yourself in harm's way so that I can be free of harm's way. This is the kindness you must do to me. Notice what he does. God caused me to wander. Because God caused me to wander, Sarah, I have to be unfaithful to our marriage covenant. You see that? In order to be faithful to God, God said, I want you to wander. I'm like, here I am, Lord. Yeah, send me. I'll go. I'll do it. I will wander of faith. And in faith, Abraham left all that he ever knew. But notice that in that moment of faith, he says, and by the way, this is going to require me, Sarah, to be unfaithful to you and to our marriage covenant. It's interesting then, because what we see here is that in order to be faithful to God, I've got to be unfaithful to other people. And I go, no. And actually, no. In fact, I think a lot of times, especially right now, people are like, oh, in order to be faithful to God, I've got to be unfaithful to my neighbor, unfaithful to the people around me, unfaithful. I go, no. No, actually, your responsibility is to be faithful to God and faithful to people. Right? God's job is outcomes. That's God's concern. The reason why he is unfaithful to Sarah in the marriage covenant and really unfaithful to Abimelech as well is because he's afraid of what? The outcome. And I go, not your problem, Abraham. Your job is to be faithful to God and faithful to people. God's responsible for outcomes. Now, you may not like the outcomes. And this is the reason why. I don't like that outcome. That outcome ends with me dead. And I don't like that outcome, so I'm going to be unfaithful. Because how can God's promise come to a dead man, right? And so really we let the outcomes. Truth be told, once again, fear, if you let fear drive your decisions, you'll often be unfaithful. If you let outcomes the fear of outcomes drive your decisions, you will often be unfaithful. And so you can actually be both. In fact, actually, we read lots of stories in here of people that are both faithful to God and faithful to people, and they trust the outcomes to God. May we be people that are faithful to God and faithful to people, and we trust him with the outcomes. It goes on then. Then Abimelech took the sheep and oxen, male servants and female servants, and gave them to Abraham, and returned Sarah his wife to him. And Abimelech said, behold, my land is before you, dwell where it pleases you. To Sarah he said, behold, I have given your brother 1,000 pieces of silver. It is a sign of your innocence in the eyes of all who are with you, and before everyone you are vindicated. Then Abraham prayed to God, and God healed Abimelech, and also healed his wife and female slaves, so that they bore children. For the Lord had closed all of the wombs of the household of Abimelech because of Sarah, Abraham's wife. There are three things that I want you to see at the end of the story. The first one is this, is that actually the story ends with Abraham being faithful. Long line of decisions, of unfaithful decisions. We get to the end, and then Abraham's faithful. Because God said to Abimelech, you get that boy Abraham to pray for you. He's a prophet. He prays for you. And at the end of the story, what do we see Abraham doing? Praying for Abimelech. And I go, that would have taken a lot, but we see actually Abraham ending on a moment of faith, of trusting in God and his promises. The other thing I want you to see is that all of the wombs, it says all of the wombs of the women of Abimelech and the household were closed by God, were now opened back up. So this is a big deal. Once again, we said, we don't know how long this took, but we know that it took long enough for them to realize, hey, wait a minute, there are no babies being born. No babies are being conceived, no babies are being born in this time. Is there a connection? So we know that. And one of the questions becomes, why did God do that? And really, it's a lot of speculation, but I think it's ironic, right, and leads to the meaning, is that this is what's plagued Sarah. Sarah's womb has been closed by God. Sarah is then taken into Abimelech's household, and all of that household's wombs are closed by God. Now, why did God do that? I think part of that is going to be a judgment. I think there's another part of that too, is that actually Sarah, in this place where she feels like she has no voice and no power, is taken to a place where she feels alone. But not super alone, because they're all going to suffer the same affliction that she's suffering. And by the way, there's something that unifies you when you suffer the same things that other people suffer. I've watched people go through it. I've watched people have this community that suffered through cancer. Then they meet somebody who's suffering through cancer, and they go, oh my gosh, I know what that's like. There's this instant bond. Why? Co-suffering. So not only does then I think that Sarah doesn't feel so alone, because nobody can have kids, and misery loves company. We're all together in this. The other thing is that God does give her a voice, because she knows evidently for these women, this is a brand new thing. And now Sarah becomes what she would become, sort of the voice of like, well, kids, let me tell you how this road goes. Let me tell you what this road is like. I'm further down the road than you, and let me tell you what this road is like. And then as soon as Sarah's restored, the wombs open back up, and we're going to see next week is that Sarah's womb is opened up. The third thing I want you to see is that this place where it seems as if Sarah has no identity, no power, no voice, is a place where then God speaks loudly. Sarah, it feels like she's got no voice, no power, no identity, and God speaks loudly. No identity. It's his wife. No voice, no power. I'll tell you what you're going to do, Abimelech, or you're going to die. You're going to send Sarah back. And then what we see then is, and then Abimelech restores her. But I think that God is having Abimelech restore her. That God then uses Abimelech to give her the identity that is to her, wife. Then God uses Abimelech to then restore the marriage. Abraham, here is your wife. And then also that God uses Abimelech to vindicate Sarah, not only privately in a dream, but then publicly among everybody. This 1,000 pieces is a sign to everyone that you are innocent, that you are vindicated, that you are made right. And I love the story how it ends, right? Starts and ends the same way. Sarah, Abraham's wife. Sarah, Abraham's wife. God cares for and defends the marriage covenant in ways that Abraham fails it. That God defends and cares for the marriage covenant in ways that Abraham fails it. Let me ask you this. Why is marriage so important? Oh. To which you look to your spouse, yeah, why is marriage so important? Why is this so important? Why is it so important? We make a big deal of it. Even now, as it actually becomes less important in our culture, Christianity wants to make a bigger deal of it, but why is it so important? I think there's a lot of answers you could give of why is marriage so important? Why is the marriage covenant so important? I think there's a lot of answers you could give. People would say, well, it's because, it's as marriages go, so goes the stability of a culture. Well, that could be true. But is that why God gave us marriage? God's like, what we need down there is stable culture. And so we're going to use the marriage covenant to do stable culture. And sometimes people go, well, it's for the bearing and the rearing of children. Is that what the marriage covenant's for? I mean, I think that happens within the marriage covenant, but is that what it's for? Because if that's what it's for, then the marriage should just terminate not at death, but at like empty nesting, which sometimes people do, right? But is that what the marriage covenant's for? Well, isn't it to find like the one? Is that what it's for? Isn't it to find fulfillment and happiness? And all the married people go, man, if you're looking to marriage to make you fulfilled and happy, look somewhere else, kids. Like, look somewhere else. Is that what it's for? And by the way, if you're looking to your spouse to bring you ultimate fulfillment and ultimate happiness, they're always going to disappoint you. Preach it now. Preach it. Preach it. What's the marriage covenant for? Did you know that the marriage covenant, the one between husband and wife, is often given to us in the Bible as a way of explaining God's covenant with his people? From Genesis to Revelation, we're often given the marriage covenant between a husband and a wife as an example of the relationship between God and his people. When God comes to the prophet Hosea, the people of Israel have been unfaithful, so God comes to the prophet Hosea, and we're not really sure how it reads. Either it reads that God says to Hosea, I want you to go marry a prostitute, or the language could read that God says to Hosea, I want you to go marry a woman who's going to be unfaithful to you. And so then Hosea does that, which we would say God would never do that until he does. And then so Hosea does that out of obedience, and what happens is she's unfaithful to him and bears other children, and then God says of that marriage, this is what my people are doing to me. The marriage covenant is giving us an example of what's happening between God and his people. Then Jesus comes. Jesus' first miracle is done at a wedding. Jesus often speaks in parables about the bride and the bridegroom. And by the way, he's always the groom, right? He's never the bride. The church is referred to as the bride of Christ. When Paul gives his teachings to couples in Ephesians 5, he says, husbands, I want you to love your wives like what? Like Christ loved the church. And by the way, this is a marriage that points us to the Son, not the Son pointing us to marriage. In other words, it was not God up in heaven, God the Father saying to the Son, these guys are train wrecks of husbands. You need to go down there and show them what a good husband really looks like. Because that's not what happened. Because otherwise, if that was the case, then he would have had Jesus get married. Really what it is saying is in the marriage, husbands, guys, the way you love your wife is to point people towards the love that Jesus has for his church. And then we get to Revelation 21. Do you know what we see in Revelation 21? It's a marriage supper. And by the way, we're the brides. It's awkward, but yeah, we're the brides, and the Lamb is the groom. And so what we see from Genesis to Revelation is this example that the covenant of marriage is to point us and to help us to explain the covenant between God and his people. And so the covenant of marriage, and why does God take it so seriously? Why is it so important? Because this covenant is one of the avenues in which God says, I'm going to point people to the greater covenant, my love for my people. And for better or for worse, it will not break this covenant. For richer or for poor, it will not break this covenant. In sickness and in health, it will not break this covenant. And interestingly enough, the marriage covenant, till death do us part, the covenant stops at death. And the covenant that we have with Jesus, the covenant begins at death. It's by the cross that the covenant is then established, and through the cross that the covenant is then maintained. And so what we see here is we see that God not only protects Sarah, but actually also God protects the marriage covenant of Abraham and Sarah. And this is a God who then put himself in the harm's way for the good of the covenant. The very thing that Abraham avoided is what